My name is Helen Littlejohn. I currently work still for the federal government at the U.S. Department of Education downtown. But my job and my reason for being here today is I was the public affairs officer for Fitzsimons Army Medical Center and the unofficial historian. My unofficial title, however, has always been the custodian of the infamous pink toilet seat. And I think everybody in here already knows the story about the toilet seat, so we just won't go there. It is just such a pleasure and an honor for me to be here, to be back at Fitzsimons again. I haven't come out a whole lot since we left during the closure in '98, but occasionally, you know, the credit union is still here, and occasionally I find an opportunity to drive around the post and see the place and just have all those memories come flooding back, and it is a wonderful experience. It's an emotional experience, and it's one that I'm going to share a little bit with you today. So thank you to the university and to all of the new Fitzsimons people for inviting me here today to talk to something that is very, very near and dear to my heart. I've known Fitzsimons for so long. She's not like a part of the family. She is a part of my family. I left Fitzsimons at closure after only 18 years, my entire federal career at that point. But there were many people who worked there for 40 years or more, literally their entire federal careers. And we have a couple people in the audience about that, that fit that bill. These people are the real historians, the people who lived and breathed Fitzsimons their entire lives. As you can imagine, it was hard leaving the place. We all left a lot of tears on these grounds as we closed her gates for the very last time. Those tears, mingled with the sweat and blood that was shed on the property since its military beginnings in 1918, made for an incredibly fertile land for what was to come next. Between the countless thousands of patients we served and all the people who were stationed here with the military and the civilian workers like myself, I'm sure there are at least 1 million stories. As the former historian of this wonderful place, I probably know, give or take, 1,000 things about Fitzsimons. The good news is I will not be telling you all 1,000 today. If you want to know the 1,000 things, check out a copy of Fitzsimons Army Medical Center, A Life in History, available at the Aurora History Museum. It's also available at the university. And I just learned a few moments ago that there is one copy at the information desk at the old 500 building. So that's not one that you can take out, but you can certainly browse through. And I keep getting these people saying, we need to reprint the book, we need to reprint the book. And so maybe we'll be reprinting the book. We produced this during the closure process. It was done as a parting gift to the employees and to the community. There are also many references about the Fitzsimons history at the Aurora Library, the Colorado History Museum, the Army Medical Department Museum in San Antonio, and the National Archives, which is out here at the Federal Center. Our Directorate of Engineering contracted Lori Simmons of the Front Range Research Association to compile a history of Fitzsimons in the mid-90s, which is included in the FAMC Life and History book. Many of the facts and dates that I will speak of come from that rendition. Part of the story also comes from the 1898 portrait and biographical record from the Aurora Central Library. I promised to share less than 1,000 things, so here goes. Because the history of Fitzsimons is not so much about the erection of buildings and the installation of machines, I'd like to share some of the people stories with you today. The stories of the people who made Fitzsimons what it was, in the context of the world at large. For most of its history, Fitzsimons was what would be called today a gated community, an independent, self-sustaining, and self-sufficient little city of its own. But that did not mean we operated in a vacuum. The outside world events very much dictated what our missions were and the size of our employment force. Before Fitzsimons was Fitzsimons, Native Americans, including Cheyenne, Arapaho, Pawnee, and Ute, resided here for thousands of years. The earliest recording European explorers in northeastern Colorado were the Spanish. Motivated by the tales of Cibola, the legendary 7 cities of gold, the Spanish organized several expeditions in the mid-1500s. In the early 1700s, the French were trading with the Native Americans. In 1803, the land became part of the United States through the purchase of the Louisiana Territory. The honor of being the father of Fitzsimons, named by me, no one else, has to go to Judge Alfred Guttheil. As a forward-thinking businessman, I wonder what he would say today with all the incredible redevelopment of the property. He was born near Leipzig, Germany. He was a student at the university at that place, graduating in 1879. In the spring of 1880, he came to America, sojourning for a short time in Maryland, Columbus, Ohio, Chicago, Omaha, and Fort Sydney, and also having charge of a stock ranch in Wyoming for a while. His first visit to Denver was made in 1882. 4 years later, he settled here permanently. He entered the real estate business in 1883, and 2 years later started the Denver Match Factory with himself as vice president and chief stockholder. But after 1 year, it was bought up by the syndicate. While it was a worthy industry, yet it was not patronized by the people to the extent it deserved. This plot of land at the end of the Aurora car line on East Colfax had far from humble beginnings. In the fall of 1896, the Guttheil Park Investment Company of Denver was organized with a paid-up capital of $100,000 and Alfred Guttheil as president and general manager. In 1889, the company purchased these 600 acres bordered by Peoria, Colfax, Potomac, and the creek. There he platted Guttheil Park Nurseries. An imposing brick entryway with wrought iron gates stood at the southwest corner of the property at East Colfax and Peoria, and as you drive by there now, you can see the sign, the new Fitzsimons. The land platted into tracts of 5 or 10 acres and were placed on the market. The title to Guttheil Park is the most perfect to be found, for it was formerly school land and was bought by the company from the state. The statutes provided that no taxes would be paid there until 1913, so that purchasers were exempt from taxation until that time. Repeatedly, the assessor of Arapahoe County attempted to assess the land, but on the advice of county attorneys, the Board of Equalization finally declared that the property was not subject to taxation until the year named. Every purchaser of 5 acres with water in Guttheil Park would, according to the contract, have his land plowed up and all ditches made to his tract. He would also receive, free of charge, first-class fruit trees of his own selection, besides shade trees for the avenues. In 1897, about 13 miles of shade trees, these were maple and elm, were planted and 50 acres planted to orchards. The nurseries were situated on the open plains, an ideal location for producing the best and hardiest nursery stock possible. Nursery stock supplied to new homes in Aurora and Denver, as well as elsewhere, included evergreens, deciduous trees, deciduous shrubs, roses, vines, hedges, ornamental grasses, herbaceous perennials, fruit trees, and vegetable roots. Their advertising pamphlets specified that we are strictly growers of hardy and superior Colorado stock, chiefly shade and ornamental, and must not be confounded with those Denver jobbers and irresponsible agents who, by means of highly colored pictures and other devices and misrepresentations, work upon the credulity and pocketbooks of unsuspecting people. In August 1903, Judge Guttheil went to the State House with a complaint. The hunters are a pest, and the people out near me say they must make an example of 1 or 2 of them. The farmers out there want to get together and club the next hunters that invade private property, as they've been doing since August. Judge Guttheil told how 3 hunters went into the fields on one place. It was one of my neighbors, he said. He told the men that they could not shoot there, but they told him to keep his mouth shut, and they banged away. He had his only one arm and couldn't fight all 3 of them, so he had to let them shoot all they wanted to. Another story he explained was a bullet whizzed through the kitchen window of a neighboring farmhouse, narrowly missing a woman who was working there, and some other hunters shot a donkey in the back. According to the local newspaper, the state game commissioner took the matter under advisement and would possibly revoke the licenses of 6,000 hunters. For many years before 1909, Guttheil Park Nurseries were pioneers in using hydrocyanic acid for the destruction of insect life. They fumigated at each transplanting and all new stock from foreign countries. Fumigation of nursery stock and state inspection were then made compulsory in Colorado. balling the roots of trees was practiced at that time just as it is today. During the first year, the company sold over 100 acres and a number of houses were built here. Among these fine residences was a large two-story house called Park Lodge. This served as the home occupied by Mr. Guthile. Every commander of the post took up residence there, and we still, driving by, call it the CD's quarters. The residence included the pond and what is now called General's Park. Guthile was married in Denver to Miss Lila B. Baker, who was born in Manchester, New Hampshire. She also owned 85 acres at the site as well. Guthile was a county judge for Adams County for many years. He died in 1955. While the residential development Guthile Park was not a successful venture, the property was to find great significance with its military health care mission. This is again in General's Park. Over the years, countless private gatherings have been held here, as well as the installation parties and picnics. We had what was known as MWR. Many of you will know what that means if you were ever in the military. That's the Morale, Welfare, and Recreation events, allowing the military and civilian employees who work together and their families a chance to play together. With the hospital being a 24/7 operation, the parties started early and continued late. Medical personnel going off shift dropped by for a brew and a burger. Right down the street from here was the old Officers Club, which is no longer with us, where all the formal military events were held. Now right in here, I'm in there someplace learning how to do the Macarena dance, and we're going to have a demonstration of that in a get-together later. Each year, the Teaching Chiefs Conference was held at Fitzsimons in the fall to assign the incoming class of medical interns to the various teaching hospitals around the country. I don't know exactly when the formal medical training program started here, but it's been going on for many, many years. I think just informally when the installation first started in the in 1918, but just kind of went on and on and on, and we always have had a reputation of training doctors. Fitzsimons, I should say, training medical personnel, because it was not just physicians. Fitzsimons was always a prized choice because of the strong orthopedic program that developed parallel to the Colorado ski industry. Nobody ever said they wanted to be here just for the skiing, of course. The beautiful grounds kept at Fitzsimons Army Medical Center before it closed served as a lasting tribute to Judge Guthile, who in his booklet said, "The evergreens are undoubtedly the most striking of our trees, even if planted singly, but are truly imposing in clumps or masses." In the early 1900s, the Denver Civic and Commercial Association, which would be called the Chamber today, lobbied Washington officials for the Denver area as ideal for a tuberculosis hospital. Meanwhile, in the rest of the world, in 1908, a law called the Sullivan Ordinance is passed in New York City, making it illegal for women to smoke in public. And Henry Ford introduces the first Model T. In 1912, the Titanic sinks on its first voyage to New York. Meanwhile, at Fitzsimons, in August of 1912, a committee of Denver boosters were looking for places of interest and unanimously selected Guthile Park Nurseries as the only place of its kind for one of its trips. Visitors in hundreds of cars came to see and admire the gardens at the park. In 1917, the United States joins the war and assists the Allies. Discussions are underway in Washington to build an Army General Hospital on the grounds. Colonel George E. Bushnell is sent to Colorado to inspect sites for a recuperation camp. Then the world blew apart. When World War I began, the Army Medical Department was ready as never before, and it was involved from the very beginning. On June 14, 1917, a young Army physician from Kansas City was one of the first American medical officers to arrive in Europe. He was assigned to U.S. Army Base Hospital No. 5 near Don-Camire, France. On the evening of September 4, 1917, a scant 3 months after arriving in country, First Lieutenant William Thomas Fitzsimons and a friend had just returned from dinner when the two agreed that the clear, cloudless night was just perfect for a bombing attack. Less than 5 minutes later, about 11 p.m., an aerial bomb struck Fitzsimons' tent, killing him instantly. He was 28 years old. Lieutenant William Thomas Fitzsimons was the first U.S. officer killed in the Great War. Later on the same night, the first American enlisted man was killed, Army medic Private Oscar C. Tugo. And as the world was turning, in 1918, Thomas Dorsey, the great jazz musician and father of gospel music, moved to Chicago, where he penned the famous "Precious Lord, Take My Hand" for the then upcoming singer Mahalia Jackson. There was a worldwide influenza epidemic, and on November 11th, at 11 a.m., World War I ended with the signing of the armistice in the forest of Compiègne, France. The War Department recommended to Congress that $500,000 be spent on construction of the Denver Hospital, which would later be known as Recuperation Camp No. 21, and later Army General Hospital No. 21. This stock certificate is one of many purchased by the local citizens in support of the medical facility. And this birth certificate is really a precious thing. It belongs to Juanita P. Sparks. She was born May 30th, 1920 at U.S. Army General Hospital, No. 21, and that was just a few weeks before the name was changed again. And I knew Juanita. She came to my office and talked to me about the history, and that's one of the most precious memories that I have of working at this place and being the historian, was to have all these people come by and say, "I've got a Fitzsimons story, and let me just tell you." And I said, "Well, I've got a newspaper to get out, but just have a seat and we're going to listen to your story anyway." The hospital opens October 13th, 1918. Lieutenant Colonel William Harlow, a native of Colorado, was the hospital's first commanding officer. Elizabeth Reed served as the first head nurse of U.S. Army Hospital No. 21, and that was our first X-ray. The first patient to arrive at the hospital was Claire W. Martin, a private from New Haven, Connecticut. At the time of his admission, several of the buildings were still in the process of being completed and furnished. Martin reached the hospital on October 17th, much to the surprise of the commanding officers. More patients arrived later that day, all via the Union Pacific Railroad tracks. And in the world, the year was 1920. Wage cuts and massive unemployment caused unrest and an increase in violence. The newly formed Hoover Commission suggests price cuts and shorter hours rather than an increase in wages. The average working day is 12 to 14 hours. The Supreme Court declares the 19th Amendment, votes for women, to be constitutional. Hooray! James Joyce's Ulysses is published in Paris. 500 copies imported to America are seized by the U.S. Post Office as obscene material and burned. On July 1st, 1920, the hospital became known as Fitzsimons General Hospital by direction of the War Department. At Fitzsimons, 3,442 admissions to the hospital, and 2,132 of those were treated for tuberculosis. The patients recovering at Fitzsimons engage in a variety of arts, crafts, and skills training as part of their recuperation, later known as occupational therapy. In 1921, George Washington Carver of the Tuskegee Institute presents his innovative ideas on agriculture to the U.S. House of Representatives. Fitzsimons radio station KEUP signs on for the benefit of the hospital patients, and individual beds are equipped with state-of-the-art receivers. They are able to tune in to hear the crooning sounds of popular music as well as the day's news. The radio was used for instructional purposes in the educational and rehabilitation section. Its operator was Joe Turre, who later set up the early police radio in Denver. And in the world, in 1922, Mussolini becomes dictator of Italy. Technicolor introduces two-color process for movies, and the Soviet Union is formed. Fitzsimons continues treating patients with respiratory and pulmonary diseases and had established its impressive reputation as a leader in the treatment of tuberculosis and in the field of research regarding the disease. Colonel Earl H. Bruns, Chief of the Medical Service, introduced heliotherapy to Fitzsimons. He was regarded by contemporaries as a pioneer in the treatment of TB and an influential advocate of surgical treatment for the disease. The Bruns room in Building 500 up on the first floor, as you come up, you go to the right, is just another example. They've kept the name the Bruns room, and so we're very excited about having that piece of historic preservation by the university as well. Also the 8th floor Bushnell Auditorium. People always ask, what is heliotherapy? And back in the old days, and this is actually before I was born. I was born in 1954, but after being the historian for so long, people just assumed that I was here in 1918 when the hospital first started. Well, I'm not quite that old, but in the old days, you could drive by some of the buildings, like right in front of the Building 500 hospital, those wards, they would have screened enclosures. When I first started working at Fitzsimons, I was working in one of those buildings, and before they looked like what they used to look like, they had screened enclosures, and the patients actually slept out there. They would spend all their time out there in the open screened areas because that was thought to be the best treatment, which it turned out to be true for treating their disease. Okay, let's see. In 1923, U.S. Steel implements the 8-hour day, a victory for labor. In 1926, the Air Commerce Act regulates civil aviation. The Army Air Corps is established. This occurs just 1 year after Colonel William Billy Mitchell had been suspended from the Army for 5 years without pay for insisting on the importance of air power to the national defense. Ernest Hemingway writes The Sun Also Rises, and Langston Hughes pens The Weary Blues. I don't need to tell you, October 1929 on Black Thursday started the stock market crash, which signaled the beginning of the Great Depression. The Chamber of Commerce and the federal government signed a 999-year lease at $1 per year, stipulating that the Fitzsimons property would revert to the chamber if abandoned by the government. Little did they know what a predilection that would become. The year was 1932. On November 8th, Franklin D. Roosevelt was elected U.S. President, and both the Winter and Summer Olympics were held in the United States. In 1933, First Lady Eleanor Roosevelt holds her own press conference, allowing only women reporters to attend. In 1939, television makes its formal debut in the United States at the World's Fair in New York. In October 1941, the total population of Fitzsimons was approximately 3,300, of which approximately 1,200 were patients in the hospital. Construction of the new main building took over 2 years, and upon completion, it was the last word in Army hospitals. It was dedicated December 3rd, 1941, and was the largest structure in Colorado. At the reception last evening, Dennis Brimhall was sharing with us the story that when they opened the hospital, everybody was saying, well, it's a wonderful place, but why is it so far from Denver? 4 days later, the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor brought America's entrance into the war. The first patients began arriving on the 17th of December. During World War II, the Women's Army Corps operated the ambulances. And in 1942, a prisoner of war camp was opened, providing medical care to German, Italian, and Japanese soldiers who had contracted tuberculosis. Again, if you were going east in front of the main hospital, Building 500, I guess I'm going to have to clarify myself here, Building 500, and you went straight down on the left-hand side is where the POW camp would have been. The POW camp was raised in 1947. In the early 90s, I remember a man coming to my office again. They just found me somehow, and he was a cartoonist in the military. And he told me that he was here during that time, and that especially the Italian soldiers who were here were very skilled at repairing cars and also taking care of the grounds. That was their job here when they were prisoners. And many of them liked it so much here that they stayed after the war. The year was 1952. Dwight D. Eisenhower was elected U.S. President on November the 4th. Everyone already knows he was a patient here in 1955 after suffering a heart attack. What I learned just not too long ago from somebody who was sitting in the audience there, Bob, was that in the 20s, and as we learned this morning from Mac's presentation, going to be President Eisenhower was stationed here in the mid-20s. And what Bob has shared with me is that they have the medical records, and that shows that he was actually treated here at Fitzsimons for an appendix thing. So that's another new piece of history to insert into our books. And Eisenhower, of course, is why we're here today for this dedication. It is not only an honor to President Eisenhower, but to all of us who served here as a part of our history is being preserved. In response to the numerous inquiries about his health, Dolores Plested, she was with the press corps, and you'll hear from her a little bit later, presented him with these red silk pajamas inscribed with this answer. In 1958, the United States launches its first satellite, Explorer 1, into space. Fitzsimons took care of thousands of patients from both the Korean and Vietnam Wars. On the 1st of January 1960, the post was renamed Fitzsimons General Hospital. And that's kind of where my first memories start, because my father retired from the Air Force in Denver in 1969. So when I was growing up through high school and college and used to come out here as a patient, that's the first inkling I had of some of the amputees from Vietnam. The year was 1963. President John F. Kennedy is assassinated in November. That same year, Fitzsimons became home to the United States Army Medical and Equipment. Now see, I've lost my talent for acronyms. We used to be able to just spin them right off. It's the United States Army Medical Equipment and Optical School, better known as USAMEOS. By 1965, more than 200,000 American troops are stationed in Vietnam as opposition to the war mounts in the United States. 11 November 1969, on Veterans Day, the Lane Recovery Suite at Fitzsimons General Hospital, Denver, Colorado, was formally dedicated as a memory of First Lieutenant Sharon A. Lane, Army Nurse Corps of Canton, Ohio. Lieutenant Lane's first assignment as an Army Nurse Corps officer had been at Fitzsimons General Hospital. She died on 8 June 1969 of shrapnel wounds received during an enemy rocket attack while on duty at the 312th Evacuation Hospital in Chu Lai, Republic of Vietnam. Lieutenant Lane was the only Army nurse killed as a result of enemy action during the Vietnam War. The Bronze Star Medal and the Purple Heart were awarded to her posthumously. My son James, who's now 25, was born on 6th West, the Labor and Delivery Ward at Fitzsimons on January 4th, 1978. And just as a curiosity, how many people either were born at Fitzsimons or had a child at Fitzsimons in the audience? I would imagine that I would see quite a few hands, yeah. We all have our Fitzsimons stories. By March of that year, I was married at the time. We were stationed in Munich, Germany. We had no phone, we had no television, and we were very, very homesick, and I had a brand new baby. My mother sent us chili powder in a care package, and I learned how to make tamales using tinfoil instead of corn husks. Now that's quite a treat. Somehow my husband managed to transfer to Fitzsimons in 1979, and we moved into 161B West Loosley Avenue, which is some of the old World War II era bungalow housing over near the golf course. And that's actually, the last time I drove by there, that was still standing, so I don't know what the plans are with that. I started working at Fitzsimons in November 1980, and I remember that day just like it was yesterday. I survived an intense hour-long drilling. This was Colonel Nasser Gaid. He was the chief of radiology, and my future supervisor, D. Yeah, you remember Colonel Gaid. He was very, very famous around Fitzsimons, and I think probably 80% of the civilian staff who worked here, non-medical, started in the Department of Radiology. That was kind of the entryway to Fitzsimons, and then you could move on to other positions there. And I mean, they drilled me for a solid hour, and all this was for an entry-level GS3 job. Our Pediatric Intensive Care Unit, or PICU, was staffed by highly trained nurses who were responsible for saving the lives of children from a 14-state region for which we had medical center responsibility. The year was 1982. In 1982, compact discs were introduced. AT&T was forced to break up. Alexander Haig resigns as Secretary of State. The Equal Rights Amendment fails ratification. Princess Grace dies in a car accident. And an artificial heart is implanted in a human for the first time. That was Dr. Barney Clark at the University of Utah Medical Center in Salt Lake. In 1983, Captain Juan Sandoval, a nurse from Fitzsimons, was assigned for 6 months to El Salvador as a member of a humanitarian medical treatment team. He evaluated hospital nursing auxiliary services and health needs within garrison areas and served as a consultant to provide professional assistance to medical instructors. In March of 1987, Army medical nursing personnel served in a humanitarian training mission on the USNS Mercy, a Navy hospital docked in Subic Bay, the Philippines. During this mission, Second Lieutenant Ronald Kirkconnell was killed in a helicopter crash while on a training flight. The lieutenant had also been assigned to Fitzsimons in the 80s. The Civilian Military Contingency Hospital System, later called the National Disaster Medical System, was introduced at Army medical centers throughout the United States, including here at Fitzsimons. It enlisted the civilian hospitals to augment the military system in case of war. But in December 1989, everything took a back seat as Health Services Command supported Operation Just Cause in Panama. Our higher headquarters, which was Health Services Command, sent 58 people to Gorgas Army Community Hospital and field medical units. Fitzsimons' participation included sending medical personnel as well as receiving medevac patients from the operation. For the first time, wounded soldiers were flown straight from the battlefield to Army hospitals in the United States, still in their muddy battle dress. I had just become the public affairs officer at Fitzsimons, and my baptism by fire was debriefing patients aboard the C-140 aircraft that landed at a small airfield near the old Stapleton Airport. Naturally, it was a media frenzy. Little did I know that it would serve as a dry run for what was to come less than a year later. In August 1990, Operation Desert Shield kicked off, and Army medicine responded with speed and dedication. Fitzsimons troops were deployed from the beginning. Here you see, this is one of the pillars in front of Building 500 that we decked with the yellow ribbons. And one of our nurses and one of our physicians. This art here is done by Army Sergeant Pete Verasano. He visited me in the office as well. They sent folks, even though they were in the Army, they actually were stationed over at Lari, and they sent them over to the Gulf War to document artistically, as we have done throughout all of the wars, the participation of the military. Our initial mission was to backfill the first units sent to the Gulf War from Fort Carson, Fort Benning, and other MEDACs. It wasn't long before some of the first injured soldiers arrived at our hospital. Another media frenzy as the eyes of the world were upon us, including all of the local media, CNN, and Larry King Live. I escorted a whole busload of injured soldiers, but they were recovering injured soldiers, and they were from our 14-state region again. Lee Greenwood came to town and wanted to visit with some of the injured soldiers, just as many entertainers over the years, you know, Bob Hope, Dorothy L'Amour, just more than I can even name. I always came to Fitzsimons to kind of generate some good morale and good feelings for the patients, and that was a wonderful thing. And so Lee Greenwood was really kind of following in an old tradition of coming out to visit the injured soldiers. When he sang his famous God Bless America, the entire crowd at the Fort Carson Stadium was just cheering and crying and carrying on, because it just kind of brought us all together there. And here at Fitzsimons, on the what we used to call Oh Dark 30 mornings that we very often worked, you could hear the wake-up sound of reveille hanging in the clear, crisp air. The only other sound was the flag snapping up the pole in the daily ritual, reminding us of why we were here. And then that little bomb dropped, the BRAC, Base Realignment and Closure. That was a simple little Army acronym that would come to mean so much in all of our lives. We had survived closure threats in the 80s. Indeed, Fitzsimons had been targeted for closure many times in its 78-year history. But the threat finally became reality. Closure was announced in September of 1995. We received our final orders. The medical center would close. 2 years later, the installation would cease to exist. That was February 28, 1998. The official inactivation of Fitzsimons was June 8, 1996. Our last commanding officer was Brigadier General John Parker. This is the last time our regimental flags flew. They retired the flags, and they actually are down at Fort Sam. I promise not to tell you all 1,000 things I know about Fitzsimons, so let me start drawing this to a close. Many of the names and events that I've described here today may be familiar to you already. In the context of Fitzsimons' history, they are well-known entities. But do you know the name Earl W. Mann as an African-American lieutenant who in 1918 was a patient at Fitzsimons? Do you know the name George Friend, who delivered the Denver Post to Officers' Row on Fitzsimons in the 1920s? He told me about eating in the mess hall and collecting Quaker Oats box tops from the patients. He recalled that the soldiers were paid $21 a month and stood in line for half a day sometimes to collect their pay in cash. As an adult, George also had the family business of Friend Furniture on Colfax. His daughter, Joan, served as a dietitian at Fitzsimons up until it closed. Do you know the name Jenny Jackson? She went to work at Fitzsimons straight from East High School in 1952, rising to the position of commander's secretary and retiring after a total of 44 years. Do you know her sister Georgia Saris, who spent 45 years working on the post, mainly in the military personnel office we called MILPO? All of our acronyms are as fresh in my mind as if it were yesterday. HEMOC for the Hematology Oncology Service, Core Zero over the intercom summoned every available nurse, medic, and doc to attempt to resuscitate a patient whose heart had stopped. You knew by the call letters, Core Zero, 2 West, exactly what ward it was, and you cringed if you heard Core Zero, 3 East, knowing it was on PEDS, the pediatric ward. Do you know the name Sergeant Ernest Contreras, who was Denver's first repatriated prisoner of war from Korea in Operation Little Switch and a patient at Fitzsimons? Do you know the name Dee McMahon, who treated hearing-impaired children at Fitzsimons in the 70s and the 80s? Do you know Major Henry Thomas, an Army Reserve dentist assigned to the 919th Medical Detachment, was one of our reserve units? He treated Panamanians in 1993 in the Strong Roads America training exercise. Do you know the name Major Otis Evans, a dust-off helicopter pilot in Vietnam who served in the Deputy Commander's office in 1981 to 1983? He later served at Gorgas Army Hospital in Panama, and then when he retired from the Army, he moved back home to Texas and became an undertaker. Otis will always have a very special place in my heart because he was the person who hired me in 1980 something or other to work in the Deputy Commander's office, which in turn led to my career in public affairs, which led to the reason that I'm standing in front of you today. So it was during these mid-80 years that the mess hall suddenly became the dining facility. Instead of generous, greasy, and actually quite yummy food slapped onto our trays, we began to get measured servings of health-conscious and still very tasty food. The fun part was buying the food at cost, since the chow hall wasn't in the money-making business. Even in the end, there was more than one old retired soldier who came to the mess hall for his 3 squares every single day. Perhaps it was for the cheap food, or perhaps just to be in a familiar place, surrounded by military comrades. Do you know the name Hilbert Potter? He was a tanker who, during Operation Desert Storm in 1991, was hit in a friendly fire accident and lost his right leg. He was so inspired by the treatment in our prosthetics and physical therapy rehabilitation that he went back to college and is now a practicing physical therapist in Louisville, Kentucky. Do you know the name Norris Cohen, who had one of the last surgical procedures at Fitzsimons? Or Sergeant William Thomas? Isn't that a coincidence? William Thomas and our William Thomas. Or Mrs. Brunhild Alexander. These two were our last official patients. Do you know the names of the last graduate medical education class? There were 26 interns, 46 residents, and 5 fellows. Now here's somebody very, very special to me. Do you know the name Elizabeth Bailenson? She performed here on live radio broadcasts all the way back in the mid-40s, and she served as a Red Cross volunteer, which is where I met her, at the hospital up until 1996. Even when she was in her 90s, she would come to the office, or I would go to the hospital and visit her, and her eyes just came alive and shone when she talked about the early days at Fitzsimons. She met her husband, Len Bailenson, here at Fitzsimons, and they got married. I don't know how many years they were married, probably 40 or 50 or maybe more. And he was a big orchestra leader down in Denver for many, many years. On May 1st, 1997, the front page of the Denver Post documented the April 30th signing of another historic lease, this time to the University of Colorado Health Sciences Center. Approvals and endorsement from the state, the university, and the federal government signaled the beginning of the move to the new campus at Fitzsimons. So now, the second part of what I'm going to talk to you about today is the future. Now, if that isn't the most busy slide you've ever seen in your life, I don't even know if you could read any of that, but it's just a phenomenal amount of information. And yes, very, very busy. But you know what? That really speaks to what's going on out here, because Fitzsimons right now is an incredibly busy place. It's a wonderful, wonderfully busy place. All of these projects that you see listed here will be done by the year 2007. By the year 2010, there will be more than 19,000 people employed here. That's a wow. These completed projects represent over 1 million gross square feet, which translates to more than 3,500 people coming to the new Fitzsimons each day. The University of Colorado Hospital Ann Schulz Inpatient Pavilion, west of the Ann Schulz Outpatient Pavilion, is currently under construction here at Fitzsimons. The new facility will include an intensive care unit, emergency department, surgery, labor, delivery, recovery department, med-surg unit, support departments, and VIP suites. The first phase of the AIP is scheduled to open in February of next year as a 99-bed, family-focused community hospital and will feature the latest in medical technology with a variety of patient-focused amenities and will represent the healthcare model of the future. The new hospital will feature all private rooms with bedside admission and discharge, web and internet access, majestic mountain views, healing gardens, including waterfalls, ponds, and meditation areas. That is amazing. I can hardly wait to get sick. Jeez. Take me to the hospital, please. Elsewhere on the campus, sorry, an Aurora developer will lead a $57 million retail and residential project on the burgeoning Fitzsimons campus, bringing shops and about 1,000 residents to new apartments within 2 years. Redevelopment Authority officials say Fitzsimons, the largest medical-related development project in the nation, will be transformed into a square mile of patient care, education, biomedical research, and development during the next 20 years. There will eventually be more than 30,000 people working at Fitzsimons. The theme will be based on a contemporary urban design. The square at Fitzsimons Commons is the largest private investment of the campus to date and will include 487 apartment units and 16,000 square feet of retail space. They also expect to lure a bookstore, which guarantees I will be coming out here, recreation facilities, and civic meeting space. The project is planned for 2 phases. The first phase should open in early 2005, with the rest left to open in 2006. Projects under construction include a support facility, Center for Oral Health, the Barbara Davis Center for Childhood Diabetes, and the new Children's Hospital, which will be moving to Fitzsimons. All I can say is, wow, wow, wow. In the first few years of this new century, the dust rarely settled from all the construction as the University of Colorado Health Sciences Center made the move to Peoria and Colfax. As always, the City of Aurora and the Chamber were at the forefront to ensure that redevelopment of the land was adequately planned and orchestrated to ensure economic success. The new Fitzsimons is what it's called now. It seems like the buildings went up overnight, in front of and towering over our Building 500, still called the new hospital, up until the days that I left. The buildings are tall, magnificent structures equipped with the latest and greatest in medical technology and research. Is it just coincidence that we were HSC, Health Services Command, and the university is UCHSC, Health Sciences Center? Can you imagine the year 2022? Where will we all be? Most of us, don't say that. Most of us will be retired. I know I will be. But the land that was Fitzsimons will be very much unretired. A viable, thriving community centered on health care. If you drive around the property in 2022, will you still see some of her ghosts? The shadows of Building 215, the original steam heating plant, or Building 405, one of the early respiratory wards, where the TB patients slept out on the screened porches to reap the most benefit of the arid Colorado climate. In 2022, all of the buildings will be fully broken in. There will be some talk of needing renovations to keep up with the modern times. All the new construction will be completed, hopefully. It will seem as if the buildings were there for a very long time. The wonderful trees that you see around Post may be some of those same early trees planted by Judge Guthile. Many have been lost over the years to disease or to weather or to construction, but many of them have survived, not only here, but throughout the metro area. But there will be one thing that has not changed since October 13, 1918, the mission of patient care, 24/7, day in and day out, just like the old Fitzsimons. Nurses, physicians, and support personnel, healing and training and conducting research to improve health care. And with hearts as compassionate and hands as caring, the spirit of Fitzsimons will live on. Thank you very much.